Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about post-structuralism, but in order to get to post-structuralism, we first need to explore structuralism so we know what the post is of. Many of those who are called structuralists and post-structuralists may well refute those labels. So as with any label or category, do remember that they're usually used to simplify life, and intellectual life in this case, and to point to broad trends in thinking. But those who are thus labelled might well see things differently. So structuralism was a new way of thinking about society and culture early in the 20th century. Structuralists were keen to look at patterns of structure, and by that I mean patterns of social organisation or patterns of social relations or systems of social and economic stratification. So they were interested in looking for structural patterns that aren't apparent superficially, so it's not really obvious. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was a new crop of structuralists who include Roland Barthes, Jacques Lacan, and Louis Althusser, and Althusser I talked about in week 7. By the late 1960s, structuralism had morphed into post-structuralism, and Derrida was very much a key figure. One of the early structuralists was our old friend Emile Durkheim, so if you remember him from week 3. So I'm not going to go into Durkheim's background because you'll be very familiar with that. He was a social structuralist. He was interested in how separate parts of a society function together as a unified whole, and that's why his work is often referred to as functionalism. He was interested in the shared culture, so the values, beliefs, customs, art, social behaviour that helps us to make sense of the world. And he reckons that all cultures are structured, particularly religions, and that culture divides the world. This is a tendency. Culture divides the world into binary opposition. So the sacred and the profane, moral versus immoral, permitted versus the forbidden. So with the sacred, of course, that's things that are holy, that's the interests of the group, and the profane is the secular, that's the ordinary and everyday. Is female to male as nature is to culture is the title of a 1974 article by an anthropologist, Sherry Ortner, who argued for the near universal categorising of women on the side of the profane and men on the side of the sacred. In other words, women are treated as second-class citizens. So when she asks that question, what she does is go through and say that there's culture versus nature, sacred versus the profane, so the holy versus the everyday, the moral versus the immoral, the permitted versus the forbidden, the male versus the female, the masculine and the feminine. So when she did that, looked at those binary oppositions, what she found is that the masculine is always on the side of the sacred and the feminine is always on the side of nature or the profane. And so what she was doing in effect then was extending Durkheim's work. Ferdinand de Saussure was developing his idea around the same time as Durkheim, but quite independently of him. He was a Swiss linguist and semiotician, and his ideas were important for both linguistics and semiology, which is the study of signs, during the 20th century. So linguistics is a scientific study of language and its structure, including the grammar, the syntax, the phonetics, some of the stuff I hope that you will have done at some point perhaps in high school. And as I said, semiology is the study of signs. Really, it's probably better to say that it's the study of communication systems. For example, language, gestures, things like traffic signs are a communication system that allows us to negotiate road travel, and which I really appreciate. I might find them a real nuisance most of the time, but if you've been in an area where there aren't very many and there's lots of traffic, suddenly you appreciate that particular communication system. So semiotics has been influential in a number of areas, including literature theory, and Saussure was interested in the way language is structured in particular ways that aren't immediately apparent. And remember that this is the whole feature here, is examining both the structuralists and the post-structuralists are interested in structural patterns that aren't really obvious. So he has some key terms. He had the idea of langue, which he said was more than a language, and it's the capacity of people to use language, which is a structured system. So it is made up of words and the rules for putting them together. So it's hard to imagine being able to communicate with somebody if you don't understand what the rules are. But we don't speak langue or language, but it does include everything in the dictionary plus the rules for how we use these words. So that's one key term that he had. The other one is parole, which is the use of speech, utterances, and speaking being done by individuals. He believed that langue is more important than parole because speaking follows the rules set down in langue. So when we use language, it's not something unique to each individual. We don't make it up. Remember, well, you probably don't remember learning, but I certainly remember thinking about even past those days, you know, when I would have initially learnt language as a very small child. I've certainly expanded, for example, my vocabulary, so I didn't make up those words, or although occasionally I might have. But we use convention so that we can communicate with each other. That's the point of conventions. And that last point is just that. The langue is the rules plus the word which determines the parole, the conventions used so that we can communicate with each other. So language is a system of signs, and Saussure replaces words with signs, and signs are the basic component of language. But signs are also made up of two components. He has the signifier, which is the sound or the symbol of a mental concept, for example, cat, and then he has the signified. So there's the word that I'm using, cat, which is a symbol for a mental concept, and then there's the signified, which is the mental concept, what I think of when I think of cat. So he's not saying that when you say cat or write cat, you are referring to a real cat, your family pet, for example, and we have a cat, but instead there are two systems. There's a system of signifiers, which is all the systems and written images of a particular language, and there's a system of signifieds, the concepts or the ideas that the signifiers refer to. And there is a relationship between the two in that they constitute or make up each other. And then there's the referent, which is the actual thing in the world, the actual cat. So I'm using an example that's often used, that of a cat. So the spoken or written signifier, the word cat, does not refer to a real cat. Instead, it refers to an idea or a concept of cat. And the idea of cat is itself constructed by the system of langue or language. Real cats in the world don't dictate what a language's idea of them is at all, but rather it is the langue or the language that dictates what the concept or idea of a cat is. So in one system of langue, one system of language, a cat might mean a household pet. That's what I think of. But in another system of language, a cat might well mean a pest or a food. And another example of that is when I was in the United States for the first time and I saw a squirrel. And for me, being an Australian who's read lots of European literature, a squirrel, particularly, children's stories, a squirrel is a cute little animal that I might quite like to have as a pet. However, in America, that it was seen as a rodent, just as a pest. So the language, so in one system of language, a cat might mean one thing, or the squirrel might mean one thing, but in another system, it might mean that it's a pest, or even food. And of course, there are real cats in the world. We know that, but when we speak of cat, we're speaking to the idea of cat that's informed by our particular system of language. So that's the connection between the long and what we are thinking about as well, what the concept is. So in other words, signifiers, that's the written or spoken words, only ever refer to the signified, the idea of things in a particular language, and not the things themselves. And those ideas are constructed or brought into being by language. Therefore, it's the language of a particular social group that shapes their sense of reality. It shapes their sense of what a squirrel is. It shapes their sense of what a cat is, for example. And the other point is that there's a complete arbitrariness about signs or words. Instead of using the word cat, we could use a completely different word like snark, as Lewis Carroll does. It simply requires the convention or the rule that everyone who speaks English uses snark to mean what we now think of as cat. So you can see that just because we have this word cat and then we have an animal in the world that we call cat, the fact that we use that word cat is completely arbitrary. So that's the point there. But the thing is that we've been using cat as a convention for centuries, and so we end up thinking of it as natural or fixed instead of thinking of it as just a convention. So the main point is that language is not just a set of words, which is all in the abstract, that refers to things in the concrete. In other words, the word rock does not have a sense because we identify it with real rocks. Rather, the language consists of a system of meanings. That is, the meaning of any one word is determined by its relationship with other words. Thus, a dictionary doesn't juxtapose words with pictures of things. Rather, it defines words in terms of other words. So when looking solely at language or systems of meaning that function linguistically, this approach is called semiotics. When looking at other phenomena, it's structuralism. So in short, any approach that sees the meaning of something as subordinate to its place within a system is structuralism. And the most important structuralists were French scholars who tried to adapt these principles to other fields of studies. So this psychoanalyst Lacan, for example, the philosopher Louis Althusser, and the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. So they took these ideas and used them in those three different fields, for example. So what's the relationship of de Saussure's ideas to social theory or sociology, I can hear you ask. So structuralism and post-structuralism took up the idea that social life is made up of different systems of signs, all of which are structured and operate as long as language. Social life is made up of different languages, each of which constructs reality in particular ways for the people who use it. And these languages came to be called discourses. And the discourses are composed of signifiers, which is the sound or symbol of a particular concept, and the signified, the mental concept. So discourses don't actually reflect or represent what is being talked about, as those aren't real objects in the world. Instead, each discourse creates its own reality. People who use a discourse may think the words they are using refer to something in the world, but most people aren't aware that their thinking has been shaped by a particular discourse. Instead, they think their thinking is just natural. To come back to structuralism, post-structuralism, many post-structuralists say that people are prisoners, actually, of the discourses or long or language, and that we're forced to use these to think and to speak. So hence the idea of prison, where we're forced to use these discourses. They also say that discourses are most powerful when we don't actually know what's going on, when they are invisible. So structuralists want to reveal the discourses which have shaped our thinking and thereby reduce their power over us, because I don't know whether you've noticed, but as soon as you understand how something works, then it gives you a bit more room to maneuver. It opens up some cracks in the pavement through which we can do things differently. So French literary theorist, philosopher, linguist Roland Barthes. He's very much interested in the analysis of text, where text is broadly defined, so you can analyse the Coca-Cola can, for example. So a very broad definition of what might be a text, a film, a book. But the thing is, not just books or things written on paper, or the idea of an article, for example, but anything where you can analyse and think about the signs and the signifiers. So very much interested in the analysis of text, wanting to expose various forms of power. There's that idea of the common sense views of the world, which we think are natural but are actually not natural, but according to Roland Barthes are actually products of ruling class ideologies. And it's these ruling class ideologies which get expressed in discourses, and the discourses are what hide the forms of social power. This is not intended, so I'll just go through these terms first. If we have a look at this advertisement for washing powder, a particular brand from Procter & Gamble, which all looks a bit 1950s to me, we're looking at different levels of meaning within a text. So things that might not be actually intentional on the part of advertisers, for example, because they're as much controlled by discourses as anyone else. If we have a look at different levels of meaning, so the first level of meaning is called denotation. What is being denoted by this text, by this advertisement? The basic meaning is that the powder produces a clean wash. So that's what is being sold to us, the washing powder. The second level of meaning is the connotation, what's being connoted in this advertisement. It is that happiness equals clean clothes, and you can pick that up from the happiness on the woman's face, for example. The idea of naturalization is another meaning. It becomes natural. We think it is natural and right to buy consumer products. And a feminist reading of this text would also say that part of that connotation is that women are happy to be washing the clothes, and it's natural for women to be doing this work. So this is part of Roland Barthes' work of extending the sorts of texts that we can analyse, so extending it beyond literature, for example, to looking at advertisements and the different layers of meaning within them, and then how that shapes and controls our thinking and therefore our behaviour in the world as well. I've talked about Louis Althusser before. He's interested in the way the discourse of the family shapes women to think they are naturally mothers, and the discourse of the education system interpolates failing working class students to blame themselves rather than see bias in the system against them. And we talked about some of that bias which was brought to our attention in Ruth Kavan's work, that the middle class people may have a lower tolerance for behaviour that's seen as nonconformist. Again, this is not deliberate. Members of the ruling classes are as much mentally prisoners, mentally controlled by discourses, as are the lower classes. So what he was interested in, which we've talked about before, is the control of a population by control of their minds. He talked about various ideological state apparatuses. So there he's not talking about those ones that can use violence, like the police, but ones, even though each of these institutions have all used violence, I should say, but it's control of our minds that he was also interested in. So in institutions like the church, the state, the families, and education system. And each of these promotes an ideology via discourses. And it's those discourses that shape our thinking, our subjectivity, and that's what he called interpolation. One of the problems that emerged from the structuralists Roland Barthes and Louis Althusser, a problem was that their work seemed to suggest that only they, and other structural analysts can determine all these underlying processes and patterns that shape people's thinking, or what we might call their subjectivity, and keeps the ruling classes and the dominated classes dominant. So therefore structuralists seem to be scientific and therefore objective, but the critics of the structuralists said that actually they were fairly naive and arrogant, because what they seemed to be suggesting was that everybody except the structuralists are idiots. So we're all dupes, we're all puppets, except these people who've become enlightened and figured it all out. What really needed to be considered was that people might not be complete prisoners of discourses, but actually use parole or speaking quite creatively. And this raised the possibility that some social groups are actually quite alert to discourses as discourses, and may even challenge, change, or reject them. So it raised the possibility that counter discourses can exist. And this, of course, is a counter to the idea that we are all imprisoned by discourses. So post-structuralism shifted away from structuralism and its focus on structure and patterns and its claim to be scientific and objective, and towards a multiplicity and instability of meanings and the complex nature of our subjectivities. Plus, it also tended to reject Marxist politics. So where Saussure believed that every signifier or word refers to a certain signified or idea, post-structuralism moves in the direction of a stress upon the completely arbitrary nature of the signifier or the word, cutting off the signifier's connection to the signified. The only source of the signifier's meaning is seen in its place in a system of signifiers. And the signifier has no necessarily attachment at all to signifieds, let alone the real things that they're supposed to refer to. So Jacques Derrida is very famous for the idea of deconstruction or critical thinking. So think about an argument between two people where one takes the point given to them and pulls it apart, looking for inconsistencies, incongruities, and incoherence. And he's the father of this idea, Jacques Derrida, who was a French philosopher. He's the idea of this idea of deconstruction, a way of criticising not only both literary and philosophical texts, but also political institutions. And he was enormously popular. From the end of the 1960s, his fame nearly reached the status of a media star. He was a rock star, with hundreds of people filling auditoriums to hear him speak. And there were films and television programs devoted to him, and there were countless books and articles devoted to his thinking. So he's a major big deal. So to come back to this idea of deconstruction, it's a strategy of critical questioning. So we talk about critical thinking. This is about critical questioning directed towards exposing what might be unquestionable metaphysical assumptions. So beyond the material is metaphysical, beyond the physical, and internal contradictions in philosophical and literary language. So deconstruction often involves a way of reading that it concerns itself with decentering what's there, with unmasking the problematic nature of all centers. And it's a form of textual practice derived from Derrida, which aims to demonstrate the inherent insatiability of both, or instability, I should say, of both language and meaning, and it rejects the word analysis or interpretation, as well as it rejects any assumptions of text. So even though it sounds unfamiliar and sounds new, it's actually not. It's something that people do frequently, energetically and willingly, even if they don't actually know that they do it. So I'll come back to that idea of an argument. So think back to the the last argument you had in a relationship. When a couple fights, they are practicing deconstruction like the best academics or philosophers. And there's a French phrase for the inevitable imbalance in relationships, which means there's always one person doing the kissing and the other person offering the cheek. Well, similarly, when there's an argument, there's one person deconstructing while the other person presents the text, usually in a defensive kind of stonewalling kind of way. The upset person, the reader in this instance, tackles the text they've been given with kind of this manic, pernickety attention, picking away at the words or phrases that are used, pouncing on sly little omissions, tying the other person's words up in knots with the full intention of proving that their discourse is flawed through and through. The thing about lawyers, that they mean the opposite of what they say, or that at the very least they're not coherent and they don't have a credible position to offer at all. And when there's that argument is happening, just about anything is open for attack. The way the other person is standing, the shifty way they're looking, the nervous jangling of loose change in a pocket is all ripe for deconstruction. And really there's only one way this can end, with one person's argument in tatters as far as the other person is concerned. And that is theory in practice, and I'm sure that you've all either been on the receiving end or been deconstructing somebody else's argument at some point in time. And I have to confess to being quite good at that myself in a fight. Another rock star feminist very much informed by the work of Jacques Derrida, whom I'm sure you will have come across if you've done some gender studies, is of course Judith Butler, who's a feminist philosopher. She's an American of Jewish heritage, very influential in the LGBTIQ plus community, and Barbara Risman mentions her as cited often by the gender rebels that I've talked about. As I said, influenced by Derrida and also by J.L. Austin and his idea, another philosopher, and his idea of speech acts, how language doesn't describe the external world but actually creates it. And the example he uses is the one at the wedding ceremony, where the celebrant says, "I now pronounce you married," actually brings a marriage into being, for example. And she's interested in the idea of categories of male and female, and says that they are just that. They're categories, they're mental constructs. There are not women and men in the world, but people that we label in that way. That is, that people don't have either a sex or a gender to express. They perform both sex and gender. People become women or men through repeated performances. Michel Foucault is another philosopher. He's actually usually described as both a structuralist and a post-structuralist, a structuralist who in fact moved towards post-structuralism. He was born in France. He was a political activist opposed during the 1960s and 1970s to the appalling conditions of France's prisons. And just as an aside, we also had very appalling conditions in our prisons here. He had a variety of teaching posts over the years, including at the University of California at Berkeley in 1980, and he died of AIDS in 1984. He's a super important figure in philosophy, history, and for activists as well in the LGBTIQ plus community. And this is because of his work on the history of sexuality, which explores how the question of sexuality came to be such a big deal. For him, power is not only negative in the way that Marx saw ruling class power as a negative restriction on the activities of the working class. Instead, Foucault sees power as productive, as positive, because it has the capacity to create as well as repress. So Foucault's early work was similar to that of other structuralists. In his Archaeology of Knowledge, he argues that the history of Western society involves different knowledge systems, which he calls epistemes. A particular period of history involves the dominance of a particular knowledge system or episteme, and the episteme provides the boundaries or defines what is possible and not possible to think about. He had a major objection to objectivities, and he reckons there's no progress in knowledge actually, but that rather one of these epistemes replaces another. I'm not sure I've got the pronunciation of that right, but you'll know what I'm talking about. So the people who are labelled by a particular discourse, and he was interested in the medical profession as well. So if people who are labelled as hysterical, which was part of the medical discourse of the 19th century, then actual fact people start to believe that labelling as well. So that's where the idea of power is productive. It actually creates people who are hysterical once that labelling happens. So discourses like psychiatry and criminology label people, and they label them as deviant against some ideal of a normal person. And these are what he calls normalising judgments. The knowledge specialists who create and use the discourse, so the doctors, prison warders, social science researchers, collect lots of information on people who have been labelled in order to know everything about them. And then this knowledge is used to try to turn these individuals into an ideal of the normal person imagined in the discourse. So the knowledge specialist works then on the minds of the people. Let me have a little think about, just go back to my notes here. So during the medieval era, authorities exercised power over, and this is something we've been talking about before, that authorities exercised power over people's bodies, violently executing them and doing that in public, whipping them. But these new knowledge specialists work on the minds of people. So whereas history would tell us that we're far less violent now, far less brutal than in earlier ages like the medieval period, but the sciences, Foucault says, have not actually liberated people from the forces of the ruling classes at all. Instead, he argues, the discourses are now the forms of people, the forms of power, and these control people in much more subtle, invisible, and therefore effective ways than previously. And this power lies in the inequality of visibility between two groups. The group that has the knowledge specialists, and the group of people over whom those knowledge specialists have power. And the idea is that we become self-regulated. So we take these new scientific discourses, they're exercised in new facilities. We had a whole lot of new facilities that started up, like the mental asylums, the prisons, the reformatories, those total institutions that Goffman was talking about. And they were designed to keep the inmates under constant surveillance of those who created them and use those discourses. And of course, an exemplary example of surveillance that you would probably be aware of is Foucault's uses the panopticon, which was not any old jail. The design of the panopticon by English reformer Jeremy Bentham, and his dates are 1748 to 1832, was actually intended, the design of the jail was intended to have inmates incarcerated around a central watchtower, since it would be impossible for a single person to observe everyone at once from this central tower. The intention was to create an environment of unpredictability and the need for self-regulation. So if inmates couldn't tell when the policing gaze would fall on them, they would have to self-regulate their own behaviour just in case it did. So the power resides in the inequality of the visibility between those two groups, the people being surveilled and those doing the surveilling, the knowledge specialists and the people whose minds are being worked on by those knowledge specialists. And I guess you're all in the position of becoming knowledge specialists, interestingly enough. So according to Foucault, these panoptic principles spread out from the prisons into all other institutions, into hospitals, army barracks, orphanages, factories, schools. And each of these, of course, have their own discourse and the particular way of exercising power. For example, through no privacy, unequal visibility, those normalizing judgments. And this works on the minds and the bodies of those who are held within those institutions. So Foucault's conclusion is that instead of increasing liberty, people are no longer controlled by a single ruling class, as Marx said, but instead by this multiplicity of discourses and techniques or forms of power which create, because power is also productive, so which create actually their own subjects. In the 1970s, Foucault replaced his archaeology of knowledge with a geology of knowledge, and he's inspired by that by Friedrich Nietzsche. So if we examine what he says, if we examine the history of an era or examine that idea genealogically, it is possible to see that the history is not straightforward, but made up of all these multiple discourses which become hidden. And the source of ideas is heterogeneous rather than homogeneous. So what looks like a really coherent progression is actually what Foucault calls an unstable assemblage of faults, fissures, and heterogeneous layers. So the way in which ideas get accepted aren't straightforward or inevitable either, but are often quite accidental and random. Therefore, what we think about as true or real or natural or inevitable are actually the result of historical processes that happen by chance. In other words, we only think the way that we do because of historical accidents. And he explored this genealogy with the idea of, or the history really, of sexuality. So one of the 20th century ideas is that normal biological sex drives are repressed by social norms. Yet the paradox was that people talked a lot, so I'm thinking kind of pre the sexual revolution from the 1960s, yet the paradox was that people talked a lot about not being able to talk about sex openly. So why could they talk about their hang-ups? So Foucault's genealogical analysis shows that instead of repressing biological sex, the social norms associated with particular discourses have worked to create new forms of sexuality, and that the idea that sex is so important that it has to be repressed goes back a couple of thousand years to the beginnings of Christianity. That we think there is something biologically based called sex that is unchanging, repressed over the last couple of centuries, particularly during the Victorian era, and that the only way to talk about it is with a priest or psychiatrist. These are ideas created by particular discourses, and in other words, we've inherited these beliefs from random or for random historical reasons, not because they are true. What's happened is that each historical period has invented forms of sexuality, and the forms of sexuality such as homosexuality and pedophilia are actually products of particular discourses that talk about sex and define sex in particular ways. So what he says is that power doesn't repress biological sex, power is creative. Discourses create new forms of sexuality. For example, a woman defined by science as frigid or a nymphomaniac is interpolated by that discourse so that her mind and body are shaped by it. But power also produces resistance. The negative categorization of homosexuals eventually led to a new counter-discourse, and homosexuals began to demand rights, legitimation, and recognition. So therefore, power is not just a property that's held on by the ruling classes, but instead is much, much more complex than that. The work of Foucault has been extraordinarily influential amongst feminists, even though he didn't pay attention to gender at all. Really what it is his interest in discipline, power, sexuality and subjectivity that has appealed to feminists, and his critique of the body as natural or prediscursive. So his very anti-essentialist position on the body. For example, feminist scholars have long been interested in how medical and scientific discourses have confirmed the pathology of women's bodies and perpetrated or legitimated women's subjection in the past, telling women what they should wear, what activities they should or shouldn't engage in. For example, during the 19th century, women were told through these discourses that too much education would shrivel their uteruses and impact on them having children. So that's been a long interest in feminists, those various discourses that have controlled women's bodies. However, one critique is that Foucault never specifies which bodies are subject to discipline and control, and therefore is guilty of androcentrism, of the male standing in for the human. So in not thinking about sex and gender, he has ignored how women's bodies are policed in ways that male bodies are not. Also problematic for feminists has been that Foucault argued that rape should be punished as a form of physical violence and not as a sexual crime. Feminists have made an argument, and I'm quoting here from Holly Henderson, that in refusing to acknowledge or account for the power differentials that underlie the patriarchal heteronormative structure, Foucault's position legitimizes the sexist working of power across the female body, which is, in a sense, a fundamental component of rape. End of quote. And this perspective runs counter, of course, to feminist goals and can also be extremely detrimental to victims of rape. So I just wanted to introduce you to a few women who are interested in feminist social theory and an example of different disciplinary mechanisms for girls' bodies. For example, Iris Marion Young's classic 1980s essay, Throwing Like a Girl. She lived between 1949 and 2006. And is an American philosopher. I think she's American. So what she says in terms of this different disciplining of girls, of female bodies, she says that girls are taught in childhood to be ladylike, and I certainly remember being told to, for example, not sit with my legs open, as men are free to do, to be ladylike, not to take up too much space, not to walk with a stride. I see many more women walking with a stride now, but certainly earlier on, that's what we were taught, and not to be too active. And there is a strong tendency for many girls to give up sport as they go into high school. So this is so these are some of the, Iris Marion Young is an example of a feminist who is interested in the particular ways in which girls' bodies are disciplined differently to those of boys' bodies. I wanted to introduce an article by Deborah Payne and David Nichols, which was published in 2001. It's called Managing Breastfeeding and Work of Foucauldian Secondary Analysis. Because what they were talking about is tensions between different discourses and how that can cause concerns for people. So the background of this is health promotion policies which really want women to feed their infants breast milk exclusively for the first 6 months for health reasons, and partially, until the age of 2 years. So continue breastfeeding beyond the 6 months where that's possible, although not exclusively. As you would all know, more mothers are returning to paid employment less than a year after having a baby, and then they have that difficulty of combining breastfeeding and paid work, which is an issue for nursing and midwifery as predominantly female professions caring for women and their children. So combining breastfeeding and paid work requires negotiating the positions of being a good mother, successful breastfeeding because that's good for the baby, and a contradictory discourse, or what can be, and that is that of being a good worker. So being a good mother confers health benefits on the infant. Being a good worker requires the mothers to constrain their breastfeeding practices. So the best practices performed by the mothers involve how they negotiate this is by doing things like stockpiling breast milk, maintaining milk supply, preparing the baby ready for absence, making sacrifices, and remaining silent and invisible as a breastfeeding mother. So they need to, in other words, the women, in order to balance these two or work this tension out, and be somebody who's a good worker, somebody who doesn't actually disrupt the workplace. They have to do all of this negotiation. So they discipline themselves by doing those things that I said about preparing the milk in advance, etc. And then they're also disciplined by others, that inspecting gaze, the authors call it, where they're watched by other workers to make sure that breastfeeding doesn't interrupt the work. So that's where somebody's taken for Foucault's work and analysed a couple of discourses that are at play in the for mothers and how it causes concern and tensions, and then they're interested in how the women then negotiate those tensions. Not an easy thing to do. So the conclusion of the paper is that breastfeeding workers have the potential actually to threaten the focus of the workplace. So that's why they do that disciplining of themselves to minimise that disruptive potential. And the such strategies therefore serve to maintain the marginalisation of the breastfeeding in the workplace and actually keeps women's efforts to continue breastfeeding invisible. So the work of breastfeeding workers needs to be better recognised and supported, is what those authors argue. And it's understanding those contradictory pulling demands on being a good mother and a good worker should be able to open up a space then to advocate for workplaces to provide an adequate space for women to breastfeed. So, after all of that, in summary, structuralists were interested in exploring patterns, but not obvious ones, subtle patterns in culture and in language. Post-structuralists wanted to move beyond exploring the patterns to wanting to disrupt everyday binary distinctions, for example, between female and male, nature and culture. And discourse analysis, as I was talking about in that final example, is a way of exploring and disrupting the discourses that do make up our social reality. So, thank you for listening.